When this series began in the lockdown summer of 2020, I would not really have believed that we would end up covering 68 sessions, with this being the 69th, looking at the history of the church throughout not only Europe, but Asia and Africa as well. And it's been a fantastic and spiritually valuable endeavour for myself to once again go over the church history that I knew, the church history I once studied, and to be honest, a fair bit which I wasn't that familiar with when I began. And it's my hope and my prayer that if you've been following this series, that it's been enjoyable and informative and spiritually valuable to you too. Sadly, at least for the purposes of this series, I'm having to draw things to a close for the foreseeable future. When I started, I always intended to at least reach the Synod of Dort and to do some dedicated episodes on the church outside of Europe, in Africa and Asia and India in particular. And that has, by God's providence, been done. But in a month's time, I am leaving my post as Associate Minister at All Saints Church in North Ferriby, and I'm moving around the world to spend 3 years working as a missionary in Japan, and alongside, as part of that, helping to deliver theological and ministry education to prospective future missionaries. Sadly, for the purposes of this series, that means I simply won't have the time, let alone the books, in Japan to carry this series forward. When I return after 3 years, I'll have to pray and evaluate my next steps and what it is that the Lord wants, and if He will open a door for me to continue with this series in some way. But that is really up to the Lord. Now, when we first began this series, we looked way back at 5 reasons why we should study church history, especially as evangelicals who often don't bother with church history. And I want to touch on them now, and with the benefit of all that we've studied, hopefully see how well these reasons have been supplied and fleshed out for you who've been following along. Now, the first reason that I gave for studying church history was that it grounds our faith. Studying church history unites us with 2,000 years of faithful saints. It shows not only why we believe what we believe, why we interpret the Bible the way that we do, but how it came to be that we understood that to be the right way to do things. It helps us ground our understanding of the Bible and what we do in church in a greater context, in a richer field of view. It gives us the confidence to say, yes, the Trinity is the God of the Bible. Yes, the Bible is authoritative. Yes, this is how we understand the 10 Commandments. And though there were seasons in the church where only a handful stood firm to true faithful teaching, we have the great benefit of not only having those great men, those few like Athanasius who stood alone against a world of heretics, but also the multitude, the near numberless amount of saints who now worship before the Lord's throne in glory, and who we will see face to face at the resurrection of the dead. The second reason for studying church history that I gave was not just about actively grounding and securing our own faith, but to defend it against error and attack from outside. This is the realm of apologetics. As we've studied church history, we've covered theological matters like the Trinity and why groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are not Christian. We've looked at why modern Gnostics and spiritual liberal types often promote so-called Gnostic gospels, but why they aren't to be accepted and weren't accepted by the church at large. And we've looked at matters of history which would debunk the conspiracy theories of people like Dan Brown and those who come out with ridiculous things about Christmas and Easter being based on pagan festivals rather than uniquely and properly Christian ones. But we've also covered a lot of the blemishes and failings of the church, which remains a human institution prone to sin and fault, and which people love to point out to undermine our faith. We've seen how many heroes of our faith were deeply flawed, like Martin Luther's anti-Semitism or the role of Bernard of Clairvaux in the Second Crusade. Yet as we've looked at these flaws, we've done so in their proper historical context, which makes them no less morally wrong or outrageous, but often demonstrates that politics and cultural matters were as if not more important than matters of faith and Bible in many of the failings of the church and these individuals. The third reason I gave for studying church history was that studying church history impacts our very vision of God and how he works in his world. How he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. How he's guided and protected his truth and his people through the millennia of war and societal and cultural change. We've seen individuals raised up in every generation who were faithful and who were powerful in righteousness and defended the faith with wisdom and truth, often in the face of great persecution. God remains faithful to his promise that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. And we've seen how he has kept that promise for 2,000 years, which gives us a grounding for our trusting in his promises to us and the church today. The fourth reason that I gave was because we've seen how God remains faithful and the same, and we've seen how those outside the church criticize it and try to undermine it with wrong teaching. We're also, through church history, better equipped to combat the error being promoted from within the church. Church division, compromise with the world and its values, living in a society which pressures the church to change with the times or die, is nothing new. And church history should have demonstrated to us time and time again that keeping faithful is what secures the church and grows the church for generations to come. We've seen all too well, time and again, the devastating effects of compromise with the world and the prevailing culture, but also the damage that completely rejecting the world and society and retreating into a wild has caused. As Solomon says in Scripture, there's nothing new under the sun, and knowing what came before equips us and motivates us more to defend what we have now against what is to come. And finally, I said that we should study church history to challenge our assumptions about what Christianity is and who is a Christian in a way that can be deeply uncomfortable but very necessary. When many of the people we studied lived, it was a very different time. They lived in very different places. They understood the world and how it was structured in different ways, society and how it was governed in different ways. Their whole worldview was different. How they understood the church was very different. All of this was different from our modern, individualistic, liberal culture and worldview. Many of the people we looked at even understood the gospel itself slightly, or even at times significantly differently from how we might articulate it here today in the West. And to this day, these divisions remain within global Christianity. And studying church history, understanding where they came from and why they came about, can help us to better judge for ourselves what are first order issues and second order issues, what are closed-handed issues that we can't compromise on and we must actively fight and defend against error and change, and what are open-handed issues where actually we can live with difference as long as it means unity in closed-handed matters. Is our understanding of the Lord's Supper or baptism or the role of bishops something we must divide over, or something we can unite with matters of difference? What about the gospel itself? How far are we willing to allow nuances and sorry, excuse me, it's allergy season. Nuances and differences in the gospel itself and how it's expressed in terms of our working alongside and even recognising the salvation of people who claim to be Christian. Church history equips us for answering these questions and more with something a bit meatier and deeper than just our gut reaction. So it is my hope and prayer that at least to some degree you feel that you've learnt and seen things which fulfilled those reasons as we've travelled through this course. And what I want to do now, just to round off all these sessions that we've done, is not so much look at the reasons why we've studied church history, but some central themes that we've seen repeated time and time again, dynamics that we've seen played out in every century in different ways and which continue to be played out around the church today, and would be played out if we do one day continue this series. And the first dynamic at play is between those who you might describe as being hotter Christians and those who are cooler Christians. Those who want a stricter interpretation of the faith and what is acceptable, and those who want more breadth and freedom, and you might even say generosity. And we saw this played out early on with the Donatist controversy, where the hotter, stricter Donatists, they refused to accept back into the church the ministry of clergy who had publicly turned their back on the faith in the time of persecution. And the Donatists were stricter not only in their lack of moral ambiguity and leeway being given, but they were much more attack-orientated towards society and its values. In the brand breadth of time, the Donatists were ultimately seen as heretics. But those same hotter kind of groups often became reform movements. The Desert Fathers, the early monastics, wanted a purer, more disciplined religious life, and the church at large was willing to demand and ask. And that constant then cycle of monastic reform movements like the Dominicans and the Friars and others was modelled after this constantly seeking greater purity, as what was formerly pure and hotter over the years cooled and dulled and compromised and became more worldly, at least in the eyes of the hotter Christians of the following generation. Ultimately, this would all find expression in the entire Reformation itself and its call to return to a purer biblical faith and all the zeal that went with that. Hence the name of the reformers and evangelicals in England early on in the Reformation being hot gospelers. Throughout church history, there seems to have been this repeating cycle of reform and hotter kinds of faith, revival you might even say, which then slowly cools, becomes lukewarm, represents the world more and more, and births a new generation of reform and revival to kick things back into gear. And tied into that dynamic, certainly related to it, but different as well, is the second dynamic, the one of retreat from or engagement with the world. For the hotter kind of Christian in early centuries, there seems to have been a tendency among them to become so exasperated with the state of not only the church but the sinful world around that they saw retreat as the only answer, either going alone into the desert, into the forest to live as a hermit, or as a group of them becoming a Christian community away from the church, away from the world. And we've seen the way that this interplayed with Docetic and Manichaean beliefs in the early church to influence early Christian monasticism, and leading to the founding of monasteries and hermitaries. But this dynamic continued to be played out for centuries, for millennia, with many monastic renewal movements calling for even greater separation, and others actually saying, no, we need to be more engaged in the communities around us, like the friars who went and lived among the people while living their vows of poverty. During the Reformation, this dynamic was greatly wrestled over, with many of the reformers seeking to reform entire cities to be like Christian monasteries and heavens on earth, where they unite the world and the faith in one. There's no need to retreat from the world if you make the whole world Christian. But then others, like the Anabaptists, often sought to retreat even from these Christian cities. And to this day, new communities in different church traditions continue to spring up as an answer to the call to withdraw from a sinful world. And at the same time, others become more engaged, taking the gospel into parts of the world where it's never been heard before. Which leads to our third dynamic, which is how the church and the world, especially in this case the secular state, interact. The early monastics fled from society partly because they thought that trying to bring about religious life reform and change by working hand in hand with the governing authorities was doomed to failure and compromise. It cannot be understated how much the rise of Constantine impacted Christianity, or how the state and the church connections in Armenia or the Ethiopian Empire impacted life there. The conflict between Pope and Emperor and European kings, the troubles and violence of the Reformation, especially seen in the English Reformation where monarchs decided so much. We see this play, this dynamic of how much is the church happy and willing to use and be used by politics and secular rulers to achieve their own goals. And indeed, even if the church believes it should exist as separate from secular rulers, or those two must necessarily be united. Which leads us on to our next deeper dynamic, still being played out today, what Tertullian, an earlier hotter brand of Christian, would say: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? So not just in secular power and politics, but in the very level of thought, what has the church, the people of God, the people of the Bible, to do with the world? To what extent should the church be guided or influenced or impacted by non-Christian thinking? Should Greek philosophy impact how the church thinks? Should critical methods of study guide our reading of the Bible and even history itself? Or should tradition and allegory and the wider understanding of the historic church guide those things? Or should it be both? And if so, to what extent? How should modern science and faith interact? What about Marxism and its derivative ways of thinking today? What about their impact on the church today? In what ways can outside thinking be useful and help to deepen our faith and show us things that we've missed in our ways of living and thinking? And in what ways can outside ways damage and undermine it? That dynamic was constantly played out throughout church history, often by those same reform movements which dealt with questions of state and church power, with whether you retreated from a corrupt world and society or you engaged with it boldly, whether you were seeking a hotter kind of faith, a stricter faith, or a generous faith which was broader and more accepting of difference. Those dynamics, they all play into one another. And along the lines of those dynamics, the church has often fractured to some degree or another, and continues to fracture to this day. And looking over the breadth of church history, you can see how on both sides errors were made and extremes taken on all of those sides of those dynamics. And it's along those dynamics that if, Lord willing and providing, we one day continue this series, we will continue to see the contours and geography of the church move and change.